child support is the right of the child. So anything that you're going to put in an agreement or order has got to pass the muster of the court. And the court's not going to be looking really at either the parent's situation. They're going to be looking at it from the child's perspective. So the idea is that it's there to support the child. So, roof over the head, food, clothing, basic necessities, those kinds of things. And then there's kind of a couple of elements that we look at to determine child support. So first of all, we look at the parenting situation to see who pays child support. The second thing we look at is income. And sometimes we look at both people's income. I guess normally we look at both people's income, but sometimes one person's income is more relevant to child support than the other. And then the last thing we look at is number of children. And those are sort of the three factors that get put into the table to figure out child support. So it's as easy as that. Thanks very much for having me. We'll see you next time.
Welcome to episode 11 of Access to Justice. I'm your host, Evan Clark from Kahane Law, and my co-host is here, Heather Malaryk of Malaryk Law. And we're joined today by very special guests. As usual, Kim McDonald of McDonald Advisory. Kim is a financial advisor and insurance advisor with Raymond James Limited. I get all that right, Kim?
Yeah, that's right. Good job, Evan.
Nice. I've been working on that for a few months now. So we are a Canadian podcast with a mission to educate Canadians about the law and about the law in general. So far, most of our episodes have been focused on family law, but stick with us. We'll get to other areas as well. We interview experts in law, mental health, and finance, focusing on topics that create the greatest barriers to entry into the justice system. You can find us on YouTube and on our A2J podcast channel, and online at a2jpodcast.com. That's A and then the number 2 and then J podcast.com. We are very pleased to welcome today's guest, Heather Malaryk. Heather, welcome.
You have to look at your screen to refresh yourself with my name.
Yeah, I was like, how do you pronounce that?
Yeah, thanks for having me here on our podcast. We haven't covered the topic of child support yet, so we figured like a quick intro to the basics would be really valuable, because I know that that's kind of the biggest concern for a lot of parents, whether they might be on the pay or the receiving end. So I think we're going to launch into that today.
Yeah, and I mean, okay, you're kind of on the hot seat, but I'm here to help out. I'm here to,
great, good. That makes
assist
sense.
And also ask you some hard questions. And I think we'll probably share some anecdotes of things that we've encountered with our clients over the years and things we wish people knew before they came to see us, specifically about child support.
Yeah. That sounds great.
So why don't we start, Heather, with...
I need to pause for 1 second. Sorry, my kiddo's microphone and camera are not working for school. And we tested it last night so that this wouldn't happen, but it is. So I will be back in 1 moment. I'm sorry. I will be quick.
No problem. I'm leaving that in, by the way.
Okay. That's fine.
Yeah, that's staying in. All right, Heather, the streaming situation's been fixed for the child?
The child is successfully Google Meeting, yes.
Awesome. It's so great that our kids get to do online school, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really good for them and it's good for parents. I'm finding teachers are loving it. It's just a big deal. It's ideal all around. Yeah.
My 16-year-old, when the announcement came out they're going back to online school, had a meltdown, like an emotional breakdown.
I can see it.
Can't do this again.
Right. Yeah. Like a silent scream into a pillow. That's what I like to do.
It was an audible scream.
Oh, okay. Okay. No pillow.
No pillow was involved.
Okay.
It was like tears and like the world is ending. How can they do this to me?
Yeah.
For her sake, we're really hoping this is just a few weeks and we're back to normal.
Yeah, and that this does the trick. Yeah, we've got the dubious honor of having the highest positivity rates
In North America?
at least in North America. Yeah, so yeah, it's not great.
bad.
Not great.
bad.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Right. So child support.
support.
Yes. Okay.
Heather, why don't we start with
So, do you want me to just sort of talk about the basics? I could start there, and then you guys can interrupt with some questions. So, let's start with the very most basic and important premise I think that everyone should know, which is that child support is the right of the child. So anything that you're going to put in an agreement or order has got to pass the muster of the court. And the court's not going to be looking really at either the parent's situation. They're going to be looking at it from the child's perspective. So the idea is that it's there to support the child. So, roof over the head, food, clothing, basic necessity, those kinds of things. And then there's kind of a couple of elements that we look at to determine child support. So first of all, we look at the parenting situation to see who pays child support. The second thing we look at is income. And sometimes we look at both people's income. I guess normally we look at both people's income, but sometimes one person's income is more relevant to child support than the other. And then the last thing we look at is number of children. And those are sort of the three factors that get put into the table to figure out child support. So it's as easy as that. Thanks very much for having me. We'll see you next time.
So, man, that is a great, simple summary of how it works. Kim, let's start with you. Give us some questions.
I have a lot of questions for you, Heather. Everybody on this podcast or our audience knows that I am not a lawyer. I am asking questions from the perspective of somebody who has not participated in child support before, and there's a whole pile of questions. So one of the things that I see in my practice when I'm doing budgets for people who are trying to figure out if they can afford their divorce is we'll get information from lawyers about what child support is used for. Like, what is it actually meant to support? So there's the regular expenses, or I don't know if there's a better word for that, the typical expenses, and then there's the extraordinary expenses, the Section 7. And I think a lot of people listening are trying to figure out, okay, if I get this money, what am I supposed to use it for? What does the courts think I'm supposed to use it for? And what are these two expense types?
That's a really good question. So, because there are kind of two elements to child support commonly. So we often talk about table support, Section 3 or Section 9 support, and that's the basic child support. So like I said, that goes to the roof, the clothes, the food, those kinds of things for the children. And that's the part that's, they're both determined by income. But let's take a situation where you have a primary parent. So one parent has care and control of the kids most of the time. And then you have a parent who's having some parenting time that's less than 40% of the time. So that would be a straight sort of table situation where there'd be a payor and a recipient of child support, and they're paying that table amount based on their income and the number of children in the table that can be found in the legislation online. I guess.
Yeah, can you just
regulation?
Let's stop right there for a second.
Yeah, I'm probably going all lawyer talk.
Table. Can you just tell us what the table's about?
Yeah, so it was developed by the government. I think a bunch of financial people, accountants, all crunched a bunch of numbers, and they basically have come up with a table. So there's incomes along one side, there's number of children along the top, and you find the two together where they meet, and that tells you what your child support amount is per month. So they've crunched a lot of numbers to try and come up with those tables so that it's generally the most fair for the most people, so that the most people who are accessing the court system and paying child support are getting treated the same way as other people who are in the same financial situation.
Let me just add something there, Heather. These people that crunched the numbers, they looked at a lot of things. I don't know everything they looked at, but I know that they looked at cost of living, cost of groceries and fuel and all those kinds of things. In fact, the table has different amounts depending which province the children are living in.
Right, yeah.
So they went that fine in detail. And nothing's perfect. Like, everyone's different and every family situation is different, but they did the best they possibly could to try and figure out, okay, based on the economic reality of this geographic location and what it costs to raise a child, like to provide the basic necessities for a child in this location, based on the income that the payer has, this is a fair and reasonable amount. Would you say that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would. And I think one of the driving factors behind it too was also so that there was some simplicity and predictability for folks, so that, you don't have to go to the court or to an accountant to try and figure out what you're paying for child support. So, you can Google it. There's tons of tables online. I mean, I'm talking about a paper table, but obviously, there's tons of calculators online, and you can just put in your province, the income, the number of kids, and it will give you the table amount. So that's a pretty simple way of getting at it. Of course, sometimes those tools mean that they're a little bit blunt, but the balance there is that it's keeping people hopefully out of court. It's making it simpler for people to figure out all of those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think one of the ways it can be a blunt tool is it doesn't take into consideration your debt service ratio. If you are servicing a ton of debt, it's going to feel like you are incapable of paying the table amount of child support and keeping the creditors at bay. That's a possible scenario if you're over leveraged or over levered.
Right. Right.
The only other thing I wanted to say about that or bring up was, no, now I can't remember. So let's move on, Heather. If it comes to me,
it'll come back.
Yeah.
Okay, so I still haven't even answered Kim's question. So we've got the table amount, and then she asked about the special or extraordinary expenses. So we call those Section 7 expenses, and you can pull those up as well. There's a whole list of them, but there are sort of listed categories of expenses that are then shared, not according to the table, but they're shared on a proportionate basis according to each parent's income. So that's where both parties' income come into play then. So if you've just put the payors into the table amount, that's going to pop out a number. For Section 7 expenses, you've got to consider both people's incomes. And some of the listed Section 7 expenses are amounts for things like prescriptions, glasses, dentists, orthodontics. That can be a big one as kids get older. Extraordinary expenses for extracurricular activities, post-secondary education. So some of these are small expenses. Some of them can really be quite large. And then, as I said, they're paid on a proportionate basis. So, for example, you have, say, $10,000 of tuition that needs to be paid for an 18-year-old child going off to university. If one of the parents is earning $30,000 and the other is earning $70,000, then those would be the proportions that they would pay that $10,000. So the $70,000 earner would be expected to pay $7,000 towards that tuition, and the $30,000 earner would be expected to pay $3,000. that may not entirely be the answer for an older child going to university, but it's a good example because the numbers work nicely. But let's say it was $100 soccer fee, then you're looking at $70 and $30 for those.
Yeah, of course you had to use like one of like the exceptions.
Right.
The guidelines start to become fuzzy, but
right.
and just to clarify, you said proportionate, which means, and the reason you used 70,000 or 30,000 is because that's 100,000. The math is easy for us lawyer types. The proportionate share would be if you earn 70,000 and together the whole amount is 100,000, then you proportionately earn 70%, and so you'd pay 70%.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's just we did that. You did that for ease of calculation.
I did. Yeah.
In terms of income, somebody who is listening to you right now would go to maybe the government website, they go to the calculator, the child support calculator, and the first thing it's going to ask for is income.
Yeah.
Are people reporting their gross income or their net income, sort of after deductions and taxes and all that kind of stuff?
So what people are going to at least want to start with is dig up your tax return and look at your line 150 on your tax return.
Not line 150 anymore, Heather.
Oh, it's line 15,000. 15000, right? Is that what it is? Yeah. Thanks, Evan. And that's the number you're going to want to start with. So then the table, the child support guidelines, then allow people to make deductions from that. I'm still going to call it the line 150 because it's my habit, but well, no, that's what we're talking about. From that line 150 income. If you're a straight simple employee that doesn't really have expenses or anything like that, for the most part, your line 150 is going to end up being your income for child support purposes. But that's not necessarily the case. So some things that I see commonly, and Evan, you can chime in if you see other ones, but like union dues are common-ish to be deducted. Sometimes motor vehicle expenses, although it strikes me that employers are not maybe require, I don't know. Anyway, motor vehicle expenses, there's a whole really laundry list of deductions that are allowable there. On the flip side of that, just because something is deductible from income doesn't mean it's deductible from income for child support purposes. So just because CRA lets you deduct it, it doesn't mean that they're going to let you take it off your income for child support. And I guess this is just sort of a flag to listeners because I don't want to get too far into the weeds and the details, but this typically or is commonly going to be if you're a sole proprietor or running your own business or an employee of your own corporation or running a corporation, any of those kinds of situations where you might have business income. And you're making deductions from them. Sometimes those need to be added back into your income, either entirely, partially. It kind of depends.
Yeah, there is some case law about that. It's like we don't have the know-how or the time to get into like, okay, what exactly will you need to add back? But what we can provide is, I'll make sure that we are allowed to provide it when we have Ken Proudman on. But he has this great worksheet that he has shared with lawyers on through his website that he operates. Called the Sweezy Disclosure form. And Sweezy's somebody's last name from some court case where there was disclosure where a corporation was involved.
Yeah.
And what that does is it will allow a person to work with their accountant to get a much better indication of what needs to be added back. Because guess what? Normally, if you're saying they're not really making that much money, they're making more. If you're making that accusation, you have to prove it. But when you're self-employed and you have a corporation, the onus is on you to provide all that disclosure because you're in the best position to provide it.
Yeah.
So if you are, in a corporation that's not at arm's length, corporation that you're getting paid by. You've got to do that. So if we're able to, we're going to have that link here in our show notes or in the YouTube description. We're just going to check with the creator of that document first, because that can be something that will help you figure that out and will allow us to move on.
And with those extraordinary expenses, do those always have to be paid to the ex-spouse, or can they go, because I hear a lot of mistrust when people are talking to me about their divorce budgets and cash flow. And people say, well, my spouse isn't going to spend this money on the kids. They're going to spend it on themselves.
On the drugs.
Or shopping.
Yeah.
Right.
Their new boyfriend.
Mortgage.
So the question is these extra expenses, this extra money that somebody's going to be paying for child support, is there a way to control, and maybe even all child support, is there a way to control how that money is used?
Another great question. And that's something that I hear, especially when you're right, when there's not a lot of trust. So the table amount is the table amount. And, I go back to the first thing that I said at the beginning of the episode is it's the right of the child. So that is payable to the recipient. And the trust is that as the primary custodial parent, they're going to be spending that money appropriately. And what I tell clients sometimes too that are concerned about this is if they're paying rent and they're getting X number of dollars in and X number of dollars out, but you also see that they're making purchases that you don't like, they're still paying rent and they're still buying food and they're still buying groceries. So some of that money is going into one bucket and it's going out of another bucket. But I guess the short answer is no, you don't get to control that money. And conversely, there's really, as long as the custodial parent is taking care of the child and they're getting what they need, there's no, there's no requirements on that parent to put that money in a particular bucket when it comes in, if that makes sense.
I would add to that, Heather, Ed Gallagher, what he used to tell me is, what he would tell the payer, the person paying the child support, when they would bring this up, because it comes up all the time, Kim. That's why it's such a good question. They're like, I know she's just spending it, or I know he's just spending it on something dumb.
Yeah.
I want the money to go to the child.
Yeah.
And I get it. Like, that's not, you're not crazy for wanting that. But what Ed would say is, look, you're the lucky one. You pay the table amount, that's Section 3 child support. You are doing your duty as a parent to provide for your child. And you can rest with a clean conscience knowing that you're doing that. And nobody can ever accuse you of being a deadbeat or not providing for your child. You're doing it.
Right.
You are doing it. The person getting paid has a responsibility to make sure that they are managing their resources to provide adequately for their child. And unfortunately, you don't get to know anything about how they manage their money. Unless spousal support's on the table, but that's a conversation for another day.
Right. Yeah, there's no accounting requirement or anything like that. As far as Section 7 expenses go, there's a number of ways that those can be managed. So, and often that goes along with the level of trust between parties. So sometimes parties might just have an agreement and they say, we'll just agree on these and we'll figure them out as they go, right? Childcare is a big one that's under Section 7, by the way. So that might be a good one to point out. So childcare is a big Section 7 expense, but it also has a tax deduction associated with it. So that's one where each parent might want to pay the daycare provider themselves and proportionately, so then they get the tax receipt. So you're not paying that money to your, to your ex and then banking on them to pay the child care provider. You're paying them directly. And you can do that with any of the expenses or most of the expenses. Sometimes people put in place a procedure where you're going to, sometimes it's a dollar amount. So they say, okay, of course, we're going to agree that the kids will be in soccer, or that they're going to, you can register them in sports. But if something's going to cost more than, and it depends on the budget, $100, $500, $1,000, you need to check with that expense with the other person if you want reimbursement for it. Or you have to show a receipt for it, so that you can rest assured that they're actually incurring that expense, and you can see how much it is, those kinds of things. Probably on sort of the end of like most enforceability or most help in controlling those expenses would be to have a written agreement or order that lays out all of the whatever Section 7s you've agreed on. And you can register it with MEP, or the Maintenance Enforcement Program of Alberta. So you insert that order into MEP, they churn it through, and they'll run all of those expenses through them. So there's a small registration fee, and they'll administer those expenses for you. So the payor pays through the MEP program, and then the MEP program pays out to the recipient. So lots of different ways to deal with those kind of situations. I hope that answers your question.
I have another thing that I'm hoping you can clarify. So it's not always the case where one parent has full, access or custody of the kids all the time. So when people are figuring out the child support, they're going to punch in their spouse's income and the number of kids, and that's going to come up with an amount.
Yeah.
What if that other spouse is currently working as well? They have their own income. How do people plug that in and figure out what the spouse is actually going to pay them?
You mean for the table child support, or the...
Yeah, because sometimes we have where it's just one person working. So it's very simple, right? We plug in their income. We know what we're going to get for child support. What if the other person is working as well? They aren't, I'm assuming, going to get the same amount. So I'm curious, or our listeners are curious, how they adjust for this. And when the people have the kids, what if it's split evenly? How does this money go back and forth?
Yeah, so Section 3 is the section that says if someone has primary care or most of the time with the children. So in that case, even if the custodial parent, or the parent that has the kids all the time, is working and earning, even if they're earning more than the payor, their income isn't relevant because they've got the kids most of the time. Where their income becomes part of the equation is when families are somewhere in between 40 and 60% of a shared parenting arrangement. So a little more, anywhere from a little more to a little less than half of the time. So, I mean, as you can imagine, all of these things we're talking about, there's like heaps of case law out there that are about, well, what's 40%? Do we count nighttime? Do we count, if we do the switch at school, do we count half of the school day? Do we count the day, like the end of, like the beginning of the school day, like who gets which time? So there's tons of litigation about that. But if you're somewhere in that 60-40 range, what the starting point, I mean, according to the guidelines, it actually says that what you have to do is look at each person's income, and you also have to look at the means, needs, and conditions of the children. So really what that means is that it's sort of like all bets are off. It's a contextual analysis. And while it is not necessarily what the guidelines say, a pretty common approach for a starting point anyway in shared parenting arrangements, so that's what somewhere between a 40 and 60% is to do what lawyers refer to and courts refer to as a set-off approach. So that's when you would put the table, you would plug the income and the number of kids in the province into the table, and you'd get the amount for one of the parents. You'd do the same thing for the other parent, and then you'd subtract one from the other to figure out what the payment would be. Again, there's all sorts of like tax issues related to set off income approach. So if you're doing that and you really want to make sure that you're okay there, because oh my goodness, I'm wandering off course. There's some deductions that you might want to make sure that your divorce judgment or agreement is well worded so that both of you can get deductions. But regardless, you just take the bigger amount, the smaller amount, subtract it, and you get a net number. And that's basically how that works.
Yeah, let me add something to kind of, I think, maybe help clarify this for people.
Yeah.
So we're talking, there's a bunch of different sections of child support guidelines that we're referring to.
Yeah.
That's when we're saying section whatever. So section 3 is also called the basic amount. That's the child support that, generally speaking, where one person has parenting time most of the time, the other person pays no matter what income the primary parent has. Doesn't matter, they pay section 3 child support every month.
Yeah.
Where there's shared parenting, then it actually goes from section 3 to section 9 child support. Section 9 is a section that's the guidelines that Heather was just talking about, where you can set off, but it's not so black and white as Heather said. It's generally speaking, that's what we try to do. Like if it's 50-50, lawyers are going to try and help people come to that place where, okay, they can do that. But it's not always appropriate, especially when the parenting situation changes. The courts may say, well, you can't just all of a sudden take away this source of income that the other parent was relying on, especially where that parent doesn't have very much income themselves. You can't all of a sudden reduce it so much because it's not appropriate given the needs of the particular situation. That's where that really comes into play. Sometimes it may be more appropriate to kind of have a gradual approach to ending up at the set off, but I don't want you to think that, immediately once I want to get to that 40% threshold so I can stop paying all this child support. If the court even gets a whiff that is your motivation for going to a 60-40 split, they're not going to be impressed.
No.
Which is a challenge maybe we can talk about a little bit later of like, how do you disentangle the financial incentive versus what's in the best interest of the child when it comes to parenting.
Yeah.
So those are those. And then there's this other thing, section 7, which is independent of both of those.
Yeah.
And that's what Heather was just talking about and what Kim was asking about, the extraordinary expenses. That's like an add-on, that's a bonus. And that's for expenses that they didn't, all the nerds that crunched the numbers left all this other stuff out because it was too variable. Like not every child is in soccer or ballet or gymnastics or whatever, hockey, right? That can be quite expensive. And so those are section 7. They're separate from the basic amount or section 9. Not to muddy the waters now that I just said that, Heather, but what if there's 2 children, one parent parents one child, and the other parent parents the other child full time?
Like a split custody arrangement.
Well, we don't say custody anymore.
I'm sorry. A split parenting arrangement.
Yeah. If you don't know, I'm sorry that I put you on the spot if you don't know off the top of your head.
I'm just trying to think. I haven't had a split parenting arrangement in quite some time. So I'm struggling to come up with the answer.
Okay, well, I just totally set you up. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
I have the answer, of course. That's why I asked
great.
the question.
Oh, fantastic. That's good.
And I only have this because I had a client where this was the case. And I had to look it up because I didn't know either. And that's section 8. Section 8 is different than section 9. Section 8 says you are doing the set off.
Oh,
It's
I was
not
gonna
like
guess
a-
that, but I thought guessing is probably a bad idea.
Yeah. Yeah, well, your guess happened to be right, Heather.
Okay.
That's Section 8. So we've covered Section 7, Section 8, and Section 9. If it's split, what we call
Okay, yeah.
split custody, it's still called that in the child support guidelines, it's still called custody. But if it's one parent having parenting time exclusively with one child and the other with the other child, or whatever combination that is,
Yeah.
then it is a set off.
I just pulled that up. So the difference of the amount that each spouse would otherwise pay. So
Yeah, the language is different. In Section 9, it's a lot more wishy-washy of you, if it's appropriate under the circumstances. Section 8 says those are
This
the
is what you
circumstances
do.
that are appropriate. Yeah.
yeah.
So here's, I got a question for you guys that just popped into my head that seems such a silly question to ask, but I don't know the answer, and I'm in finance. How do people actually get the money? Does the one person EFT it on a systematic, like set up automatic to go into the other person's bank account? How is the money moving?
Yeah, however they want, I guess. I think a lot of people do, e-transfers now or bank transfers. You can write checks. You could provide a stack of post-dated checks at the beginning of the year if you wanted to do that. Other folks use the maintenance enforcement program that I spoke about before. So that's not just for those Section 7 expenses that are part of child support, but can also be used for the table amounts if folks want to do that. One of the nice things about MEP is that they also have, they keep a very nice accounting and record keeping of all the payments that are made. So, it can alleviate a lot of disputes. Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways. People could, I suppose, pay each other they could pay in cash if they wanted to. I haven't seen that happen a whole lot, but
Yeah. Okay.
money is money.
Don't pay cash. Don't pay cash. You could, it's not like you can't, but if there's any kind of dispute about how much is being paid, don't pay cash because there's no record.
Yeah.
I love e-transfer. E-transfer is one of the greatest innovations that the Canadian banking cartel has come up with over the past 10 years. It's secure, it's safe, there's a record, it's traceable.
Yeah.
You just make sure you get the email right.
Right.
And provide have a good password so that you don't just send it to somebody with a really easy guessable password and then it's gone. There's nothing you can do about it. E-transfer keeps a record. So
Yeah.
MEP is very good, especially if it's high conflict or where one party is just kind of they do pay, but sometimes they're late, and that really makes it a challenge. MEP is great. MEP is not great where there needs to be some flexibility.
Yeah.
And where somebody's in an industry where their income does fluctuate from year to year quite a bit, and it needs to be a real-time adjustment, MEP is not the place to go because the only way you're going to fix that is with a court order. And while you can do it by consent relatively quickly, if there's not consent, then it's not going to be quick and it's going to be a huge pain. So MEP is great, except for when it's not great, then it's terrible.
Yeah, and they have a lot of enforcement. The reason to use MEP is because not only do they administer the payments, but they also have enforcement abilities that, if you have an order or a judgment, you can take civil enforcement steps on that. But it costs money and it's difficult. You'd probably have to hire a lawyer and all sorts of things to try and do that. And it's really not often worth the trouble. But the maintenance enforcement program has enforcement actions they can take. So usually they start somewhere around, they'll send reminders, warnings. They'll try and enter into a payment arrangement with the payor. But they can start doing things like suspending licenses. They can garnish wages. They can garnish bank accounts. They can interrupt.
They can garnish government benefits as well.
Yeah. GST returns, tax returns, all that kind of stuff. So
passport.
Yeah, right. So
they've got baseball bats and they know how to use them and they will use them.
And they will, yeah. So Yeah, they're a good tool for those situations where you really do need those enforcement mechanisms. But Evan's right. If the payor needs some flexibility sometimes, and the recipient's okay with that, they can be a bit. Again, a blunt tool for that.
Yeah, and let's just be clear. You can't block somebody from registering with MEP.
No.
If the payee wants to register with MEP, they're going to do it, and they can do it. It's their right. In every single child support order, there's a clause that must be in there that says this order will be registered by MEP if one of the parties wants to do it.
Yeah. And payors, I've had payors benefit from registering with MEP as well, because if you're in the situation where there's a dispute over whether you've made payments, because that does happen too, right? Like as Evan alluded to, don't pay cash because there's no record. Sometimes that happens where, the payor is saying, well, I paid though, and the recipient refuses to acknowledge that. So MEP keeps a nice record of that.
Kim, I've got another question, but I want you to have another go.
Okay, I'm looking to know more about the duration of child support. So this is a selfish question because a lot of people come to me and say, well, I know what I'm going to pay for child support roughly based on an initial discussion with a lawyer. And then I usually say, well, did they indicate how long these payments are going to last? And then the answer is usually like, oh, we haven't talked about that yet. So I think a lot of people are wondering, once you get this set up, how long do you have to pay? I'm sure it depends in there, but is there a common payment period?
Yeah, well, you've been hanging out with enough lawyers, Kim, to know that like it depends is our most favorite thing. So if you're a married couple and dealing with support under the Divorce Act, child support is payable so long as and when the children remain children of the marriage. And that's a defined term in the Divorce Act. So often that's when they reach the age of majority, but they can remain children of the marriage because of some certain circumstances. So attendance full-time at post-secondary is often one of those situations. Or if a child is unable to leave the charge of their parents for some reason, and that might be by virtue of a physical or mental disability. So in the case of a child that's attending school, what happens is things get muddy again. They get complicated. So sometimes that child's not living with one of the parents. Maybe they're going off to another province or another city or town to attend post-secondary. So who's the payor, who's the recipient, who's the child residing with? Neither of them. So that becomes complicated. Do the parents continue to pay table child support at all? Do they pay table child support to the child? How do they share the costs of post-secondary education? And there aren't necessarily straight ahead answers to those questions because again, the court tells us we have to have a contextual analysis of those things. We need to look at the child's ability to contribute. Are they working a part-time job? Are they able to secure bursaries, loans, scholarships to contribute to their education? Often a first degree, they're not going to start looking at this, but often with higher learning after a second degree, they're going to start looking at what the child is pursuing in university and their chances, or post-secondary and their chances for success of that. So a first arts degree is probably not going to be questioned too much, but if a child then pursues something that has very little chance of leading to an employment opportunity or something that's going to be valuable, then a court's less likely to order that child be supported in those circumstances. They're going to look at some of the plans that the parents might have had while they were still together for the post-secondary education of their children. So did they have RESPs in place? Did they talk about sending their kids to post-secondary and supporting them? Or had they always told their kids, like, high school, after that, you guys are on your own. Start saving now, those kinds of things. And lastly, they're going to look at the financial circumstances of both parties. So if you have a child that wants to go to Yale and it's going to cost them, I don't know what Yale costs these days, but I'm assuming it's somewhere in the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's just not going to be practical for parents to be supporting if they're both earning $30,000. It might even not be practical if they're both earning $80,000 or $100,000. So lots of stuff that it depends in that category.
Yeah, and I wanted to just refer to I just pulled up the definition of child of the marriage. Of course, what you said is exactly right, Heather. It says a child of marriage is a child who is under the age of majority, who has not withdrawn from the charge of the parents. So that changes from province to province, of course. In Alberta, it's 18. British Columbia, it's 19. Is the age of majority or over and under their charge, but unable by reason of illness, disability, or other cause to withdraw from the parent's care in order to obtain the necessaries of life. Now, the reason this is a little bit complex and can be confusing is that's the Divorce Act. In Alberta, we have the Family Law Act, and each province has their own version of that act. The Family Law Act is when parties have kids that either they're not married or they're not getting a divorce yet, but they need to deal with this issue of child support. Then it goes under the Family Law Act here in Alberta. And that has the same but different definition. And the difference is that it tackles this issue of post-secondary education more head on. And so the analysis changes slightly if you're under the Family Law Act or the Divorce Act. And I don't think it's important to get into those details right now, but just so you're aware, there's a difference, and you can talk to a lawyer about it. They'll be able to tell you. As Heather's already indicated, a lot of things go into it. Uh-huh. Let me just kind of give let me just put a thought into your brain about this. Do you want to be that guy or that gal who's really fighting not to support their child's post-secondary education? Probably not. But do you want to be that guy or gal who is just trying to milk the other person for as much money as they can and kind of abusing the system in order to do that, such that it creates a court fight about whether or not child support is still payable? This is it's such a sticky kind of situation. And so really, ideally, hopefully, people can kind of agree on what that's going to look like. And the earlier you agree on it in advance, the better, because then there's some certainty when that time comes.
Yeah, if you have elementary school age kids when you're separating, and I'll bring up this topic with my clients, they'll be like, are you kidding me? You want me to figure out what we're going to do for university?
Yeah.
But I mean, really, if you can have that conversation early on, then it helps for financial planning for yourselves and for the kids as you move forward. So if you know you've agreed with your ex that, we're not going to pay the child table amount, but yeah, let's help them out with their education. And parents often still have RESPs for their children that they're contributing to once they're separated to support those plans. It's never too soon to think about those things, and it's never a bad idea to have them contemplated in your separation agreement or divorce documents.
Kim, you're hitting all the high points. What else you got?
Yeah.
So the next topic is two words that that pop up a lot if you get involved in family law. The words are imputed income. And this is, I think, a super important topic.
Did you shiver, Heather?
I did. I'm like, oh.
Imputed income. I learned about imputed income in a textbook, and I was like, this is very interesting because people often worry about their spouses purposely not working, so their income's low, they don't have to pay. What happens when income is changing? How does that move the dial in child support? And what do the courts have for tools to help get the income right? So what are your thoughts, you guys?
And one of the terms of art there, Kim, is intentionally underemployed. So Heather, on that note, take it away.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about adding stuff back into income, and like that's not the same as imputing income, right? We're just sort of like trying to determine income at that point. So if you have someone who's running a business and you think they're over deducting expenses, we're not necessarily going to impute income back into them. We're going to look at their expenses and add that back in. But sometimes you might have a business person who during the marriage or relationship, they were drawing a decent salary of X number of dollars. And then suddenly 6 months after separation, their salary's gone down by 40%, 80%, whatever it is. So their income, if you look at it in their tax return, their line 15000 says X number of dollars. You look at their expenses, maybe you can, add a little bit to that, but you're still not getting something that you think it was before. So then you can look at the financials of the corporation and see if there's money that is available to them that they are not paying to themselves and impute that income to them. But as Evan said, you kind of have to pass that hurdle of intentional. Well, that's different, actually, the underemployed part. So that's one of the situations where you can impute income back into someone. So they're not declaring it as income. Maybe they're not even taking it as income, but there's money available there that should be, from the court's view, being paid to that person for the support of their children. So the court is basically saying, like, I don't care if you can live on $30,000 and you're saving the money in your corporation. That money is there and it's available for your children, and it should be going to the support of your children. So we're going to say that you are making your pre-separation income. We're imputing income to you. We're going to say your income is this, even though your tax return says that. I think the other situation that you're talking about is where, one of the parties says, like, well, they should be working, or, they're just staying at home with the kids, or someone is not taking as many shifts as they could be or they were before. So as Evan said, you would have to show that the person is intentionally or underemployed for the purposes of defeating child support. So I'm just going to say it as simply as this. That's tough. That is pretty hard. If you've got emails from your ex that says, like, well, whatever, screw you, I'm going to quit my job then.
Good luck getting any child support from me, buddy.
Right? Okay, maybe you have the two elements, right? But most of the time, you're not going to have that kind of evidence. It's going to depend again on, like, what's the economy like? What's this like? What are the job opportunities in their field? That kind of thing. But that's a tough one. That's a tough one. What do you think about that, Evan?
I've never dealt with this for child support. I've dealt with it in the context of spousal support or partner support. That's a little different. It's the same but different. There's less, like in child support, if you're really doing that, I just don't think it's all that common that people would purposely become underemployed to defeat child support. I just haven't, I don't know that I've ever seen that where, like, oh, that's really, really what's happening here. People, most of the time, they want to do the right thing and they want to provide for their child. And when a lawyer tells them child support is the right of the child, that rings true with them and they want to do it. That's been my experience. Spousal support, nobody, and I mean nobody wants to pay it. And if somebody, and I haven't seen it where somebody is intentionally underemployed who's the payor, but for the payee who's like, I'm not getting a job, you're paying spousal support, buddy. Why should I have to work? And that's totally understandable, and kind of like, it's a vindictive approach that, like, you get it, right? Like they're ticked off at this person, and why should they have to work? They didn't work during the relationship. They wanted to be a stay-at-home parent. They want to stay home with the child, and that's understandable as well. And so they're not going to work. Well, I don't want to get too sidetracked, because that spousal support is a different issue. We'll talk about that later. But I've seen it more in that way. And by the way, even in that situation, I agree with you, Heather, it's tough. How do you prove that? The court sometimes doesn't need you necessarily to prove that intention if circumstantially it's pretty clear that the person could be working. Like, if you're just not working at all and you're not, don't have a disability, then the court, I don't think that it's too much of a stretch for the court to say, okay, you could be making $15,000 a year at McDonald's, making minimum wage. But beyond that, I mean, I agree, Heather, I think it's really tough.
I've been successful sometimes in imputing income too, in situations where there's like maybe cash jobs are happening, things like that. Sure. But you've got to, you need some decent, reliable evidence there as well. So, yeah.
Right. It puts the court in a tough situation. Like, put yourself in a judge's seat, who's impartial, dispassionate third party, and you're asking them to impute income to somebody. If you don't have a lot of evidence, what are they supposed to do? It puts them in a tough decision, even if they think it might be happening. If there's no evidence, or not convincing enough evidence to support it, either direct evidence or circumstantial evidence, I mean, the judge it'd be hard to find that fact.
I certainly have the folks that are making a decent wage, they're working hard, and they're surprised by the amount of child support that they have to pay. And it bothers them. And not that they don't want to support their children, but as Evan said, maybe they've got, they're servicing debt of the relationship, or, a mortgage they can't get out of, all sorts of factors that are going on. They want to, take care of themselves for retirement, all of that stuff. And then they say, well, why don't I just stop working then? And I won't have to pay so much. But, sometimes I just kind of walk them back from that, or walk them through that and say, do you really want to, cut off your nose to spite your face, basically, right? Are you going to take that cut to your lifestyle then, right? Do you not want to drive a vehicle? Do you want to move out to somewhere, to move out of the place that you're living in, those kinds of things. So that's something to think about too, if you're on the payor side and you're kind of not happy with what you might be having to pay.
This is probably a good time to bring up taxation of support payments. So taxation is different for child support versus spousal support. And I know sometimes lawyers look to see, what money's coming from what bucket, and there are potentially ways to save some money for the payor. For example, child support is not taxed in the hands of the recipient, so it's a favorable way of collecting money. What do you guys typically tell your clients about the taxation of support payments?
That they're not, that you're paying them with after-tax dollars. The reason so I think you're kind of alluding to spousal support versus child support. Spousal support, periodic spousal support, as opposed to lump sum or paying it all at once. Periodic spousal support is paid with before tax dollars by the payor and is taxed in the hands of the recipient. Child support is not that way. This policy reason, the person paying child support is supporting their child. It's not going for the benefit of another person or increasing their income. It's for the child. That's the whole concept about it. And so, it's not like a tax write-off. You don't get a tax write-off for getting divorced. You get treated like everybody else as far as that goes. Yeah. Right. I don't get a tax write-off for buying food for my children.
Right.
maybe that's something we could look at. I would be down. But so far the government doesn't agree with me that that's a good idea. And so child support falls into that category. For spousal support, you're literally shifting income. That's the purpose of spousal support, is to more or less equalize income. And so if we're equalizing income, then you're going to pay income tax on that increase in income. And it would be unfair. Like, the government reluctantly doesn't double dip on that. I'm sure they'd love to, but they don't double dip. And so if one person's paying income tax, the other person will not be paying income tax. And big asterisk, I'm not a tax lawyer. I don't practice in that area of the law. I do not give tax advice. And I know it's the same with Heather. Kim, you're probably the best suited here to give any kind of tax advice, but I know you're also not an accountant, and we really look to accountants to take, or tax lawyers to shoulder the liability that comes along with that type of advice.
Yeah.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got, you're probably laughing here. I have so many questions on child support. It's because I don't have kids and I don't know how child support works, other than what I put into cash flow analysis for people divorcing.
Mm-hmm.
So a question that came up once in a practice question for an exam I was writing had to do with child support being paid to stepkids. And the question had to do with, so you have your own biological kids that you're paying child support to. Let's say you've been living in the same household with your stepkids for the majority of their lives, 10 years, let's say. Maybe they're getting money from their former, from their parent, the other parent. Maybe they're not. But what is the responsibility for somebody when stepkids are in the picture?
Well, what I can say to preempt Heather's answer is, we don't have time for that question. It's what you're referring to, Kim, is called standing in the place of a parent. And it's complex, and there's some issues, and it's something we can certainly simplify and talk about, but not today. Mm-hmm. We've got to wrap it up. I did just have one quick scenario I wanted to put to Heather. It's one that I've come across recently, so I wrote it down here.
Oh, no.
And then after, I don't think it's going to take too long to answer, Heather. And then after that, we're going to have to wrap up. Okay, so let's say I'm going through divorce, and let's say I want a 50-50 parenting situation. We haven't gone to court. There's no parenting order. Mm-hmm. The other parent is just not down, not interested in even talking about it. No, I'm getting them every other weekend or something like that, or every weekend, as the case may be. Can I just switch to a Section 9 set off to encourage the change and to encourage, because that's what I think should be happening and is the best interest of the child. So you know what? I'm changing the child support because I should be having 50-50 parenting time.
So just unilaterally revoking child support
there's no court order.
Okay.
It's just fresh. Mm-hmm. But the parenting reality is I only have them every weekend. I don't have them half the time. But the only reason is the other person is just unilaterally making a decision about parenting time. Right. I'm capable and willing and want to do it. I firmly believe it's in the best interest of the child. So can I self-help by just paying what the child support according to what I think the situation should be?
I mean, I certainly wouldn't recommend that. Two wrongs don't make a right in the eyes of the courts for the most part. And I usually say to my clients that the amount of child support that you're paying should reflect the reality of what the parenting situation is. So if you're not happy about what the parenting situation is, then you've got to get that matter to court or before an arbitrator or mediator or whatever method it is that you want to use to resolve that dispute, to get that side sorted out and then let the child support follow. But I think we've mentioned it here many times before. Courts don't like self-help remedies. They don't like it when you make changes on your own because you think that that's what's right.
Great. That's the advice I give, Heather. So I'm glad.
Phew, I'm relieved too. I'm relieved.
Okay, on that note, thank you so much, Heather, for being mostly on the hot seat, and Kim, those are some great questions. We're clearly going to have to do another episode where we can talk a little bit more about this, because Kim, you've got more questions and we want to get them answered. But this has been another episode of Access to Justice. Thanks for listening and or watching. If you have any questions you'd like us to address on the podcast, send an email to accesstojusticepodcast@gmail.com. That's access, the number 2, justicepodcast@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to get you an answer on an upcoming episode. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Any information in this video is general information only and is not, nor is it intended to be, legal advice. Watching this video does not create a lawyer-client relationship. You should always seek the advice of a lawyer or other qualified professional for advice regarding your individual situation. While we take care to ensure that the information contained in this video is accurate and up to date, we make no warranties or representations as to the suitability, completeness, or accuracy of the information contained in this video. Any reliance you place on the information is at your own risk. Kahane Law Office, Merrick Law, Heather Malaryk Professional Corporation, Evan Clark Professional Corporation, Evan Clark, Heather Malaryk, and any guests will not be responsible nor liable in any way for any content, including but not limited to any errors or omissions in the content, or for any loss or damage of any kind incurred as a result of any content communicated in this video, whether by Evan Clark, Heather Malaryk, or by a third party. Kim McDonald is a financial advisor with Raymond James Limited. Information provided is not a solicitation, and although obtained from sources considered reliable, is not guaranteed. The view and opinions contained in this media are those of Kim McDonald, not Raymond James Limited. Securities-related products and services are offered through Raymond James Limited, member Canadian Investor Protection Fund. Insurance products and services are offered through Raymond James Financial Planning Limited, which is not a member Canadian Investor Protection Fund. Raymond James advisors are not tax advisors, and we recommend that clients seek independent advice from a professional advisor on tax-related matters.
Turn water into wine. See through me.